Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Wade from the Bureau's Events Management team. I will go over some logistics before we begin. Please be aware that this event is being recorded and will capture webcam images and the voices of all speakers. The recording will be shared publicly by the Bureau. A link to live closed captioning will be placed in the chat box. You can access the chat box by going to the lower right side of the WebEx window. If you experience any issues with your audio, click on the audio button near the bottom right of your screen. The audio options are located within the circle button with 3 dots near the bottom of the WebEx window. There you will receive guidance on switching audio to your telephone. To manage the way that you are viewing the speakers today and their slides, click on the Layout button located near the top right of the WebEx window. Please add your questions to the chat box at any time during this session. For technical support during this webinar, use the chat box to send a message to the host, and I will provide assistance. Now I will turn the event over to Kenneth McDonald from the Office of Consumer Education.
Thank you, Tracy. And thank you all for attending today's webinar on medical debt. As many of you are aware, medical billing and collections can hurt people's financial stability and security. This can happen at a time when people are struggling with a health-related issue. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is taking action to address this issue. In this webinar, CFPB experts will discuss the following: findings from recent CFPB report, Medical Debt Burden in the United States, policy changes regarding medical debt credit reporting, paid and low balance medical collections on consumer credit reports, hospitals required financial assistance programs, and consumer complaints, medical debt and credit reporting. We will begin with our first speaker, Arthi Kannan, who will present findings from our recent report, Medical Debt Burden in the United States. Arthi?
Thank you, Ken. Hi, everyone. My name is Arthi, as Ken just said. I'm in the Director's Financial Analyst program at the CFPB, so it's a rotational program. Currently, I'm in the Office of Research, along with some of the other presenters you will hear from today. But last year, I was in our Office of Markets, where I worked on medical debt issues at the Bureau. Specifically, I was in consumer reporting markets, so I focused a lot on how medical debt affected credit reporting, background screening, teen screening, et cetera. But I helped the debt collections markets team at the Bureau author the report I'll be talking about with you all, Medical Debt Burden in the United States. So my presentations today will focus on findings from this recent report, as well as forthcoming policy changes regarding medical debt credit reporting announced by the nationwide consumer reporting agencies. So this report, Medical Debt Burden in the United States, used a variety of sources, including previous Bureau research on medical debt, new findings from the Bureau's Consumer Credit Panel, CFPB consumer data, and various other survey data and external research. The report includes 4 sections: 1, the medical debt landscape; 2, focusing on some adverse impacts of medical debt; 3, COVID-19 impacts; and then finally, legislative and regulatory developments. This report used the CFPB's Consumer Credit Panel to estimate the scale of medical debt in collections on credit reports. So the CFPB has a 1 in 48 representative sample of US consumers. Some facts that you'll see on the slide here that we found from the CCP are there are $88 billion in medical debt in collections. As of 2021, 58% of all third-party debt collection trade lines were for medical debt, making medical debt the most common debt collection trade line on credit records. The next most common collection trade line was telecommunications debt at only 15% of trade lines. So 58% in medical debts, 15% in telecommunications debts. It's the most common debt collection trade line by far. We also found that the median balance on medical collection trade lines was $310, and 62% of medical debt collections were under $490. This map that you'll see on the right-hand side shows the state-level prevalence of medical debt on consumer credit reports as of 2020. As the map illustrates, there are geographic differences in the prevalence of medical debt in collections by state. So you'll see the South has the highest percentage of individuals with medical debt in collections. A 2021 study published in JAMA found that 23.8% of the population in the South had medical debt in collections, compared to only 10.8% of the population in the Northeast. The South not only has a higher prevalence of medical debt in collections, but it also has a higher balance amount of medical debts in collections. Debt balances were higher in the South. The mean balance was $616 in the South, compared to only $167 in the Northeast. Diving a little further into the medical debt balance amounts we observed in our consumer credit panel. As this graph shows, many medical collections on consumer credit reports are low dollar balances. In 2020, the median medical collection was $310, and 62% of medical collections were under $490. So you'll see that a lot of these are concentrated on the left-hand side of this chart. However, it's important to note that many people with medical debt have more than one collection on their credit record. As of December 2020, the median person with at least one collection owed a total of $797 in medical debt. However, some medical debts might not be included on credit records, but are captured in surveys. So for example, in a 2017 Census survey, households with medical debt reported owing a median total of $2,000, which is clearly higher than our estimate of $797. But since not all medical collections are furnished to consumer reporting companies, the total amount of medical debt in collections in the US is likely even higher than the CFPB's $88 billion estimate. So as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, medical debt is more prevalent in the southern United States, but we also see that certain demographic populations also face higher rates of medical debt. Black and Hispanic people have more debt than their white and Asian counterparts. Black and Hispanic people are also less likely to be insured. And in general, uninsured people tend to have larger medical debts than insured people, partially because they are often charged significantly higher prices than insured patients. However, 62% of those with medical debt say that the person who incurred the bills was covered by health insurance at the time of service. So health insurance isn't sufficient to fully protect people from medical debt. We also see that young adults aged 25 to 37 and low-income individuals of all races and ethnicities are more likely to have medical debt. Additionally, people with disabilities also tend to have higher than average levels of medical debt, and older adults and veterans are also heavily impacted by medical debt. The differences in insurance averages might contribute to these disparities. Stepping back a bit, just want to add here that the cost of medical care can vary widely. So medical bill amounts can be unpredictable and can often vary widely based on patient and provider characteristics. Uninsured and out-of-network patients are often charged prices that are much higher than what in-network insurers pay, even though the uninsured may have little ability to pay. And prices charged to uninsured and out-of-network patients sometimes significantly exceed providers' costs. And markups are especially high for emergency care, and for-profit investor-owned hospitals can charge higher average markups. But for many of these reasons, we found that medical debt can have extreme adverse impacts to consumers, including impacts to one's mental, physical, and financial health. So a little bit more about the financial health impacts. People with medical debt report much lower levels of financial well-being, and these adverse financial impacts come in a few forms. One form is credit score decreases. Past due medical debt reported to a consumer reporting company can appear on a person's credit reports and lower their credit scores, which might reduce their access to credit and make it harder to find a home or a job. And as we mentioned earlier, medical debt is by far the most common collection on credit reports. However, medical collections are less predictive of future repayment problems than are non-medical collections. And certain newer credit models take this into account, but some widely used models still weight medical and non-medical collections equally, which means that the populations that I mentioned on the last slide who are more likely to face medical debt might be more heavily impacted by outdated credit models that overestimate the predictiveness of medical debt. Some other financial impacts of medical debt include bankruptcy and costly collections litigation. There are also physical and mental health impacts. We see healthcare avoidance. 46% of people with medical debt purposefully avoided care. This can be particularly problematic if preventative or early care is avoided due to cost, and if conditions then spiral into dangerous and more costly health issues. We also see that people with medical debt have an increased risk of chronic pain and early mortality. We see that 4 in 10 people say that they're more afraid of medical debt than of serious illness. This is very distressing, and medical debt can take a distressing toll in many individuals' lives. We see that people with medical debt can have increased incidences of depression, anxiety, and unfortunately even suicide. And many of these adverse impacts have only been exacerbated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 50% of all people affected by COVID-related hardships had medical bill or medical debt problems in the last year. Particularly uninsured payments might avoid seeking COVID-19 testing and care out of fear of medical debt, contributing to further physical health problems. People of color are also more vulnerable to COVID-19 related medical debt. And recently, 72% of insurers have stopped waiving deductibles, copays, and coinsurance costs for COVID-related care. That concludes the portion about findings from our recent report, but I will talk a little bit now about the changes to medical debt credit reporting policies that were announced by the nationwide consumer reporting agencies, so Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. So in March 2022, shortly after the release of the medical debt report, the 3 NCRAs, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, announced that they will remove certain medical collections from people's credit reports. So the 3 NCRAs announced that they will, 1, extend the waiting period before furnishing medical debt from 180 days to 1 year. This will go into effect shortly. And secondly, they announced that they would remove medical debts paid by consumers, also effective this month. And finally, they announced that they will stop reporting medical debts under $500, which will go into effect sometime early in 2023. To that last point, recall that we found using the CCP that 62% of medical debt collections were under $490. So this is a hopeful change. Some of these changes will be made on the NCRA's end when compiling consumer reports. Others of the changes will be made when directed by the furnishers providing information to the NCRA's. The Office of Markets at the CFPB, both the debt collections market and the consumer reporting markets, are very interested in following how these changes will actually be implemented. And Lucas Nath, who is our next presenter, will be speaking more about Bureau findings released just yesterday on the impacts of these policy changes on medical collections and consumer credit reports. But first, we have a few minutes for questions about my presentation, and we'll also have more time for questions at the end after each presenter's time, and then all together at the very end. But for now, are there any questions just about my portion?
Yes, Arthi. We do have a question here from Sonia. She's asking, what will happen with existing medical debt on credit reports which are under $500?
Yeah, so the Office of Markets attended some sort of industry events where they discussed what will happen to retroactively to existing debts that are below $500. I don't believe that we have confirmation on what will happen to those collections, but I believe that more information will be released shortly. One of our other presenters might be able to speak to this coming up, but I do not have an answer to that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. We've got a couple more that are coming through here. From Anita Beasley, will the PowerPoint slides be made? Yes, they will be. From Brittany, is there any particular reason why we see higher medical debt in the southern states over the northern and northeastern states?
Yeah, so we've been in contact with the medical providers, with policymakers in these states, and there are a lot of reasons contributing to why these levels are different. A lot of it has to do with existing laws that determine what providers can charge in different states. And since these vary state by state, we see that in the South, costs for medical services can be higher. We also see that a correlation between where Medicaid was expanded and insurance coverage in these states contributing to higher amounts of medical debt.
Thank you. We've had another question here from Idris Tucker. Is it possible to make hospital sponsorship for hospital bills automatic for nonprofit hospitals so they can give away more than 1% of revenue?
Unfortunately, I'm not able to speak to this question. I think this might be a question that would be directed to the folks in our debt collections market who have been speaking more with hospitals and hospital trade organizations. But that is a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not able to answer.
No worries. Thank you very much. We have another here from Brittany Fox. Is there any particular reason why we see, we did this, sorry about that. These are coming rather fast. We have another one here from Dawn Hall. What happens with medical debt the consumers have proof that has been paid, but is still showing up on their credit report?
Yeah, so previously, before this change was announced by the NCRAs, it was only medical debts that were paid by insurance that would be able to be removed from reports. Now we have this change that's allowing all paid medical collections to be removed. If you have a paid collection that is still showing up on your consumer report, we recommend that you would file a dispute with your with the NCRA and dispute that portion on your credit report. And you can show proof that that has changed and it has now been paid off, and those should be removed. I think, again, someone had asked about automatic and retroactive changes, but yeah, that should be removed as long as you're able to provide that information. Certainly, if you notice that, it shouldn't be there.
Thank you. We've got another here from Shanta Gray. She wishes to add into Sonia's earlier question. Is there a process of removing those medical debts from credit reports if we find those debts still exist on the credit?
Yeah, so I think similarly to the my response to Dawn about a debt that you believe should have been removed through this process and has not been removed, can also submit contact the consumer reporting agency on whose report that you found this debt, and send them this information, and they should be in contact with you about the process of removing that.
And I'd also like to add, if you still are having troubles having that removed after you made attempts to contact the reporting agency, you can always submit a complaint to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau through our website at consumerfinance.gov. I have another question here from Cindy. I often hear healthcare costs are the #1 attributor to a person's filing for bankruptcy. How does this data relate to that statement? Is it true?
So in this report, Medical Debt Burden in the United States, we actually dive quite a bit further into the financial impacts of medical debt, and we do have a few paragraphs detailing how medical debt plays a role in bankruptcy. We do see that medical debts can be a large cause of folks filing for bankruptcy, and we do talk about that more in our report. I definitely encourage you to go check out those paragraphs, and we definitely see that a lot of these financial impacts tie together with one another, and a lot of people who do file for bankruptcy do have help.
Thank you. And we've got another question here. You've generated a lot of questions, Arthi. Celicia Langford is asking, will paid medical debt be removed automatically, or will a person need to manually call and request it?
Yeah, I think this is similar to Don's earlier question. Sorry, I'm trying to read the full question. Again, I believe that should be removed for you, but if we find that there are errors in credit reports sometimes. So if someone finds that there is an error and debt was paid, it should be removed. Again, you can contact the specific credit reporting agencies on whose report you found that debt.
Okay. And Shanta Gray is asking, is there a law we can reference when we need to file disputes?
So I think if you're discussing the dispute as related to the new NCRA announcement, you can refer to the announcement. Otherwise, if you need to file a dispute about anything on your consumer report, you can, the CFPB information or website has information on the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So what I would recommend, determine, what exactly you're disputing. Is it a medical debt? Is it an inaccurate payment or repayment status? If you go to the CFPB website and you look up how do I dispute something on my credit report, we have a lot of information and you can see which specific, item you would want to reference. But specifically for medical credit reporting, the main sort of actions you'll want to be familiar with are the Fair Credit Reporting Act, NCAP, which is the National Consumer Assistance Plan, which is what sort of dictated a lot of these changes previously. You'll also find more information about that in a report. And then finally, this recent NCRA changes.
Thank you, Arthi. And I'm going to have to cut off questions after that one. We are capturing these questions and we will get back to you all for those questions we were not able to get to. And so we'd like to continue on with our program. Thank you.
Sure. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Lucas Nape, who is in the Bureau's Office of Research, to talk further about medical collections on consumer credit.
Thanks, Arthi. And hello, everyone. My name's Lucas Nape. I'm currently a research analyst in the Office of Research. And in a report published yesterday, Ryan Sandler, myself, and the rest of our team investigate medical collections that are likely to be removed from consumer credit reports in the next year due to the policy changes we've discussed. As Arthi mentioned, on March 18th, 2022, the National Credit Reporting Companies announced that they would change the way medical collections are reported. Specifically, the companies announced that starting July 1st, the time before unpaid collections appear on consumers' credit reports will be increased from 180 days to 1 year, and paid medical collections will no longer appear on reports at all. They also announced that beginning sometime in 2023, medical collections with balances below a threshold of at least $500 will no longer appear on consumer credit reports. These changes have the potential to reduce the amount of medical debt reported on consumer credit reports and to benefit some consumers. Here's the usual disclaimer that Arthi covered. It'll apply to this presentation as well. And in the report, we hope to find a baseline for what the effect of the policy change might be. The report contained 3 primary sections. First, the characteristics of consumers with reported medical collections. Second, the persistence of medical collections on credit reports. And lastly, which medical collections are likely to be removed. We begin by getting a sense of what consumers' medical collections look like, as well as what other types of debt they were holding before that medical collection was added to their report. The first column describes medical collections trade lines. The second column focuses on collections with an initial balance of less than $500, and the last column is limited to collections that were eventually reported as paid. The collections in the second and third columns are those that would likely be removed in the coming year due to the reporting policy change. Although almost 2/3 of medical collections trade lines have an initial balance less than $500, a very small percentage, 2.6%, are ever reported paid. Consumers with medical collection trade lines typically have lower scores even before the medical collection appears, with an average score of 573 in the quarter before the collection appeared, as compared to the national average of 714. About 75% of medical collections are associated with consumers who already had at least one medical collection, and 53% are associated, medical collections are associated with consumers who had non-medical collections. And then toward the bottom, you can see here that scores decline between 12 and 17 points on average in the quarter before the medical collection appears. Next, we turn to the persistence of medical collections on credit reports. The impact of medical debt on consumer credit reports depends in part on how long a collections trade line continues to appear on a record. Less than 20% of medical collections trade lines are still on consumer credit reports at the end of 4 years. This figure shows the share of medical collections that remain on consumer credit reports since they were initially reported, separately for initial balances above and below $500. One clear pattern sticks out, and that is that low balance medical collections remain on credit reports significantly longer than higher balance medical collections. For both balance amount categories, the share of medical collection trade lines that are still reported quickly drop in the first few months after the initial report, and only around 3/4 of collections above $500 are still reported 180 days later. As a result of the medical collections reporting change, some collections that drop off quickly may never appear at all, since this change will extend the grace period up to 1 year. And then moving on, finally, we focus on medical collections that are going to be removed in the next year. This figure shows the share of consumers with medical collections in green, the share of consumers with all collections less than $500 or paid in orange, and the share that have unpaid medical collections greater than $500 in blue. You can see that in 2017, almost 20% of consumers had at least one medical collection trade line on their credit report, and that share has been falling in recent years. Still at the end of our sample in March 2022, 14% of consumers, almost 1 in 7, had at least one medical collection on their credit report. And over time, the share of consumers who have only paid and low balance medical collections has fallen as well, while the share who have at least one unpaid collection of more than $500 has stayed relatively constant. In March 2022, about half of consumers with medical collections on their reports would have no medical collection if the reporting change were in effect. And this would leave about 7% of consumers overall with at least one medical collections trade line, as indicated by the blue line. And as previously discussed, there's heterogeneity across different states when it comes to medical debt. And so here we'll look at the geographic distribution of which medical collections are likely to be removed following the reporting change. As you can see, consumers in West Virginia stand to have the greatest share of medical collections removed. More than 80% of medical collections trade lines associated with consumers in West Virginia are likely to be removed. And these trade lines represent more than 30% of the total balance of medical collections in that state. West Virginia has the greatest share of consumers with at least one medical collection trade line, and the second highest number of medical collection trade lines per capita, which explains this outlier status. Finally, we examine how low balance and paid medical collections are distributed across census tract demographics. As a baseline, the first column reports the share of consumers in the full CCP who reside in census tracts in each category. The second column reports the distribution of consumers with at least one medical collection trade line across the categories, and the third column represents the distribution of consumers who will likely have at least one such trade line removed. And finally, the last column reports the distribution of consumers who will likely have all of their medical collection trade lines removed by the reporting change. Consumers residing in majority Black and majority Hispanic census tracts are overrepresented among those with medical collection trade lines relative to their share of consumers in the CCP overall. While consumers in majority Black census tracts comprise only 6.2% of consumers in the CCP, they make up 10.5% of consumers with medical collections. Now, turning to the lower part of the table, we can see that reported medical collections are concentrated disproportionately among consumers who reside in census tracts with lower median income. For instance, while 13% of consumers in the CCP reside in a census tract with median income below $40,000, more than 21% of consumers with medical collections reside in those census tracts. At the same time, consumers with medical collections who will likely all be removed following the change are slightly more likely to reside in high-income census tracts when compared with consumers to all consumers who have medical collections, as indicated by the fourth and second column toward the bottom. This report showed that a substantial share of medical collections currently reported on consumer credit reports likely qualified to be removed under the change recently announced by the national credit reporting companies. The Bureau will continue to analyze how medical collection reporting changes may affect consumers, and you can find the full report at the link here. And now I'll take some time to address some questions before turning it over to my colleague Eric Wilson, who will discuss hospitals' required financial assistance and its relationship to medical debt. Thank you.
Oh, Lucas, we do have a question from Idris Tucker. Because FHA mortgages don't consider and conventional mortgages look only at medical debt over $2,000, and business loans may also not consider medical debt. Is it likely that these changes will affect a greater proportion of medical debt collected overall?
Sorry, I'm just rereading the question to make sure I'm getting locked in. It's a bit cut off. Is it likely that these changes will affect a greater proportion of medical debt? What's the rest of the question?
collected overall?
I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with FHA and mortgages and the interaction between medical debt and underwriting for those loans. But I'd be happy to, ask someone who knows more and get back to you about that question.
Thank you, Lucas. And we have no others, so we can turn that over to Eric.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. So my name is Eric Wilson. I am also a research analyst in the Office of Research. My general research focuses on financial well-being and things that affect financial well-being. So naturally, the financial impact of medical care is a big topic in my life. So Lucas and Arthi discussed the prevalence of medical collections, who experiences medical debt, and how medical debt and even the possibility of medical debt affect consumers. We've also talked about some of the big changes to how medical collections are reported in credit records and what those changes might mean. Now we're going to move upstream from medical debt and collections to a topic related more to the affordability of healthcare itself, which is the financial assistance programs that hospitals are required to create for patients who may be unable to manage the costs of the care that they receive. So to complement the materials that Lucas and Arthi already discussed, we have also released a background brief on our website about these programs, which you may know more by their common name, charity care. That's not a term I'll be using here. In the brief, we use the term required financial assistance instead of charity care because it reflects the idea that this is actually a mandatory thing that hospitals are legally obligated to do. I'll start with some background on what these required financial assistance programs are. Then I'll move into the question of who is eligible for these programs, followed by the slightly different question of who actually receives financial assistance. And I'll warn folks at the top, data and research on these financial assistance programs proved fairly scarce. The central conclusion that we drew in the brief that we recently released is that more research is required to understand how people access financial assistance and the impact it has on their finances. So what is required financial assistance? Financial assistance is a community benefit. This is medical care that is provided for free or at a discount to patients who cannot afford to pay for the care that they receive. This provision of financial assistance is mandatory for nonprofit hospitals in order to maintain the tax and other financial benefits that come with nonprofit status. And federal law actually requires nonprofit hospitals to communicate their policies for financial assistance to their patients. Specifically, under the Affordable Care Act, nonprofit hospitals must widely publicize their financial assistance policies. They must provide a paper copy in plain language of a summary of the policy as part of their patient intake or discharge process. They must display their policies in public spaces at the hospital itself, and they have to include website links and contact information about the financial assistance program on their billing statements. Now, some states actually have additional requirements. For example, in addition to providing the policy in writing, Washington State requires that hospitals inform their patients verbally about the policy itself. And Washington State also requires that hospitals, prior to attempting to collect on past due medical bills, that those hospitals actually screen patients for eligibility with their financial assistance programs. So who are these eligible folks? Federal law actually doesn't specify the criteria that hospitals are supposed to use to determine who is eligible for financial assistance. State law, however, does in many instances, but those requirements vary widely. Most of them, however, are based on the federal poverty level. So, for example, This is a screenshot of New Jersey's income criteria for eligibility for financial assistance programs in the state of New Jersey. What you can see is that for people making less than 2 times the federal poverty level, care at a nonprofit hospital can essentially be entirely covered by financial assistance. New Jersey has some additional requirements on top of this, which include an asset requirements. But what this means is that, and essentially in New Jersey, a person in a family of 4 making in 2022 less than $55,000 per year could be eligible to have their hospital bills largely taken care of in many circumstances. And as income increases in New Jersey, that care is still discounted until income actually exceeds 3 times the federal poverty level. Other states have different criteria. In Washington state, for example, the threshold for free care is only 100% of the federal poverty level, and discounted care phases out at 200% rather than the 300% level that you see in New Jersey. So eligibility does not necessarily imply actual receipt of financial assistance. To the question of who actually receives financial assistance, the answer is that there isn't much evidence available about that question, but what does exist suggests that not all people who are eligible actually do receive it. One of the studies that we discussed in the brief comes from 2015 and found that only 44% of all hospitals reported actually notifying patients of their eligibility for financial assistance before initiating a collection on a past due bill. But that study actually used data from 2012, which was from before the full implementation of the Affordable Care Act requirements. So it's hard to say where things are now. We do have some anecdotal evidence from litigation. So there's an ongoing lawsuit, I believe, from the Washington State Attorney General alleging that several hospitals failed to notify patients of their eligibility and pressured patients who were eligible for financial assistance to pay their bills anyway. Now, among those who actually do receive financial assistance, the available evidence is also scarce, but what we do have suggests that there's a strong gender imbalance. Study from New Jersey in the early 2000s, for example, found that women were twice as common as men among recipients of financial assistance. So that about does it for my bit of the webinar. You can find the full brief on the Research Hub section of consumerfinance.gov. In the brief, we go into more detail on the points presented here, including some information on funding mechanisms for financial assistance programs, as well as policies that are aimed at improving the reach of financial assistance programs. We also expect to release more research on this, as well as in other areas that where the health system actually has an effect on consumers' finances. But for now, I will take some questions and then flip it back over to Nicole Lawson, who will discuss some of what we hear from consumers on medical debt and medical collections. So questions.
We do have a question from Idris Tucker here.
Yep.
Will this financial assistance apply to rehab type care? He said, we found a local addiction center that would waive 75% of the costs if clients returned a form, but only 5% of the clients do. So they end up with collections for this amount that might have been free.
Gotcha. So as I understand it, the sort of federal mandate for financial assistance programs and these state programs apply specifically to nonprofit hospitals. So if that care occurred within the context of a nonprofit hospital and was, provided in an arrangement where the nonprofit hospital was actually responsible for the care, then that type of assistance might indeed apply. But it very much depends on the status of the actual institution providing the care.
And he was also asking a follow-up. He noted that they're about removing time limits for care that would have been covered by the hospital sponsorship if applied for. So some systems have 8 to 9 months time to apply, and then those debts could have been free from collections.
Gotcha. So time limits, it sounds like maybe a part of some hospitals, payment policies. I don't think that there's necessarily a requirement for that particular thing. I don't think the federal law that we've examined for this particular brief goes into the removal or the extension of time limits. But if those time limits do exist, and to the extent that they do, that's a relevant piece of information for consumers who may be eligible for financial assistance, generally speaking.
We have a question from Virginia Valenzuela related to the time limits. Does the financial assistance ever apply for debts retroactively?
That is an interesting question. I think so in some states, again, I think in Washington State, the hospitals are required to actually check to see if people who owe and past due medical bills are eligible for their financial assistance programs before sending those bills to collections. So in that instance, if you would consider that to be applying retroactively, then yes. That's the main thing that I can think of that we talk about in the report that might speak to that particular question.
Thank you. We have no more questions, Eric. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. And that does it for me. So I will send it over to Nika right now.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon. My name is Nika Lawson. I work in the Bureau's Office of Consumer Response. So what exactly does the Office of Consumer Response do? The Office of Consumer Response is responsible for hearing directly from the public through consumer complaints. So we use complaints to inform a variety of the Bureau's activity, including supervisory, enforcement, rule writing, and educational efforts. Additionally, complaints are used to monitor the financial marketplace. Today, I'll be briefly discussing the recent report that we published analyzing medical billing and collection issues that consumers describe in their complaints. Now, before we jump into the findings of the bulletin, I want to briefly walk you through the complaint process so that you can better understand how we handle complaints and what information forms the basis of the report. Excuse me, I'm having some technical difficulties. Give me a second. Before we jump into the findings of the bulletin, I want to walk you briefly through the complaint process so you can better understand how we handle the complaints and what information forms the basis of the report. Handling consumer complaints is one of the 6 enumerated functions listed in the Dodd-Frank Act. We accept complaints across several consumer financial products and services. At a high level, the Bureau accepts complaints through 3 channels: online, over the phone, and through the mail. We then send these complaints to review and response. We publish select information in our public consumer complaint database. Consumers can also provide feedback after they've received a response. Finally, we analyze the information and report out on it from time to time. In 2022, we're currently on pace to handle more than 1 million complaints, and it's an approximately 15% increase from complaints handled in 2021. Now, this past April, we published a complaint bulletin that explores the topic of medical billing and collection issues. This report is available on the Bureau's website, and it's the report that I'll be discussing today. Now, in our review of complaints submitted, Complaints involving medical billing are often submitted in one of two categories: debt collection and consumer or credit reporting. Now, complaints in the debt collection category are typically about ongoing efforts to collect an alleged outstanding medical bill, whereas complaints in the consumer or credit reporting category are often about ongoing efforts, as well as information appearing on consumers' credit reports that they state are inaccurate. Now, the most common issue in debt collection and across all types of debts is the issue of attempts to collect debt not owed. This issue makes up nearly half of medical debt collection complaints. Now, as seen in the chart, complaint volume about this issue has increased in recent years. Notably, complaint volume about attempts to collect debt not owed increased 31% in 2021 compared to 2018. In these complaints, consumers provided varying reasons for why they thought that the medical debt a collector was attempting to collect was not owed. For example, consumers reported that they already paid the debt. Some consumers reported that their insurance companies remitted payment. Other consumers reported that the medical care was covered by workers' compensation. In other cases, consumers stated that they learned of an outstanding medical bill when they were contacted about it by a third-party collection agency, so they promptly paid the debt and yet continued to be contacted about that said debt. Even some service members reported that they were contacted by third-party collectors for medical debts covered by TRICARE or other government-sponsored insurance programs. Our colleagues in the Office of Service Member Affairs recently published their annual report, and on that report, they further explored the issues that military members, veterans, and their families are experiencing with medical debt. That report is also available on our website. Now, in recent years, we've also seen an increase in complaints related to written notifications about debt. In complaints about a medical debt collection, nearly a third are related to the written notification about the debt. As shown here, as a percentage share of each debt type, this issue is most common for medical debt. Consumers sometimes reported that collection notices did not contain sufficient information to identify and verify the alleged debt. For example, consumers often stated that they were not familiar with the provider listed in the written notice. Now, this can happen when the name of the healthcare provider listed on the notice is different from the name of the professional or professionals who provided treatment, as is often the case when a provider is part of a larger medical group. This can also happen when the notice comes from a third-party debt collector that the consumer has never heard of, or when there is simply not enough information on the notice to identify the debt. In other cases, consumers reported that collection notices contained large amounts of personal medical information, such as information related to personal medical procedures, tests, and medications that the consumer found upsetting or alarming. Now, in consumer reporting complaints to the Bureau, consumers often stated that they were never contacted about medical bills before they were reported to the credit reporting agencies. Consumers often stated that they only became aware of a medical bill when performing a routine review of their credit reports or while in the process of applying for credit, such as applying for a mortgage. Oftentimes, these bills are old and small. In some instances, consumers become so frustrated trying to resolve questions about alleged debts that even though they feel they don't owe these debts, they pay the debt collector just to make the collection effort stop and also to increase their credit scores. With the announcement about medical debt furnishing, we'll be monitoring complaints to assess whether these problems will be alleviated. Finally, in response to consumer complaints, companies frequently close the account and discontinue their collection efforts. These actions raise some concerns about the accuracy of information being furnished to the credit reporting companies. As I mentioned earlier, we make complaint information available to the public so analysts, researchers, and others can utilize this data to inform their own efforts. You can access this information by visiting our website at consumerfinance.gov. Finally, if you're working with the consumer or if you personally have an issue about a consumer financial product or service, you can submit a complaint to us online, over the phone, or by mail. Our online form is available 24 hours a day, and it's the most efficient method for complaint submission. Fun fact, it only takes about 7 to 10 minutes to complete the online submission form. However, if you prefer to submit a complaint over the phone or if English is not your primary language, don't worry about it. We've got you covered. You can call our 1-800 number and speak with the representative. Our representatives are able to accept complaints in 180 languages, and they can also provide status updates or answers to common questions. With that, I'll turn it back to Ken. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Nika. We have a question here from Idris Tucker. He'd like for you to repeat again about closed accounts. He said, I have often seen closed medical debts and wonder what that means when a balance is still reported.
Let me just go back to the question. So this does happen from time to time, and even just as, we're all consumers regardless of what we do for a living. So I know there are times when we've paid a debt and we still see it being reported on our credit report, and we have to go back and chase the service provider and say, hey, I already paid this, why is it still being reported? So one of the things that we always say in the Bureau is to please submit a complaint. If you've already tried working with the service provider and they're being really difficult about it, go online, go to our website, consumerfinance.gov/complaint, and fill out, submit a complaint. And what we'll do is we'll route the complaint over to the company in question. And, while you're submitting the complaint, we also urge that consumers submit as much supporting documentation as possible, because I'm a firm believer that, you can't argue with facts. And if you can showcase that this debt was already paid and I don't know why it's still being reported, we've seen a lot of instances of this happen in the past, but for the most part, companies are generally very kind about this because, mistakes happen, and they'll review the information submitted, they'll review the complaint, and for the most part, some companies will come back and say, you're absolutely right, we made a mistake on this, we'll go ahead and notify this debt, and we'll reach out on behalf of you to the credit reporting agencies and get them to take off the whatever's being reported on your credit report.
Thank you, Nick. We have another question here from Vanessa Reynolds. Do hospitals and medical communities have a standard or required procedures to follow for collecting and reporting medical collections?
So I'm not 100% sure about the answer to that question, and I'm willing to take it back as an action item, or if any of my colleagues on the line happen to know the answer to that, I welcome you to respond. But I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm willing to take it back and find a way to send you a response.
Okay, thank you, Nika. And we have a question here from Mac Ritter. He said, we have seen many consumers who have disputed wrongfully reported medical collections, for example, a bill covered by insurance, only for the account to say on the report with a note stating, account disputed, customer disagrees with findings. Are there other steps aside from submitting a complaint to take to remove the account?
I think I'm still a firm believer to first of all submit the complaint, and it's still okay to work behind the scenes with the service provider to see if there is a way for them to take it off. But I think submit the complaint first, and then it gets rerouted. And also, I don't think it hurts reaching out to the reporting agencies as well, because ideally, you want the service provider, the original service provider, to be able to, review your complaint and rule in your favor and go back on your behalf and to the reporting agencies and get them to take it off. But I don't think being aggressive hurts. So I think it also helps to, if you also want to work behind the scenes while you submit the complaint and let that process continue, still go behind the scenes and see if that maybe you can call someone and maybe get some FaceTime and let them know, hey, this is what's happening. This is inaccurate. And I think, once again, supporting the documentation as much as possible, if you're able to present supporting documentation to showcase, to bolster your argument. I think, starting with submitting the complaint and then maybe doing some additional things behind the scenes where you're contacting different reps from different companies to see if they can help you resolve the issue.
Thank you, Nika. We've got a question here from Brittany Fox. I've always been told if you have a medical debt to contact the original provider and pay them rather than pay the third party. Does it make a difference?
I mean, I think it always helps to go straight to the source. But I know in this day and age, companies are so interconnected. So, go straight to the source and give them, the background and overview of what's happened. And, I think in some cases they will be able to kind of rectify the issue on their own. But if you're having issues, realize that, okay, this is 100% helpful. Once again, it doesn't hurt to also go back to the third party and document, your conversation or what the findings from your initial conversation with the first provider, and just say, hey, I just talked to them and this is what they're saying. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, and just kind of get them to kind of be in alignment with one another so that you can get the decision the favorable decision that will work in your favor.
Thank you very much, Nika. Okay, we have a question here that could be sent to Eric. Hold on, let me get to it. Eric, do hospitals and medical communities have standard procedures to follow for collecting and reporting of medical collections?
Yeah, so I can't speak directly to like all of the possible required procedures for collecting and reporting medical collections. I can tell you that some states, again, the Washington State example that I've talked about before, do require hospitals to check that their patients are eligible for financial assistance before putting a past due bill out for collections. I suspect it may be possible, at least, that either Lucas or Arthur may have more to say on that particular question, but I will let them speak for themselves.
I just want to add one last thing. If you're ever in a position where you've tried every option available to you and you're still not making any headway, we also encourage you, if it's within your means, also looking to hire an attorney to work in your favor. I know sometimes litigation does help. We're not saying that should be the final resolution, but there are some instances where it might be it might work in your favor to look into hiring an attorney or speaking with an attorney for advice.
Thank you very much. We do have a few other questions here that I would like to pose to our panelists. Hold on for 1 second here. Okay, Lucas, we have a question for you. Will removed medical debt only be with the 3 major credit reporting bureaus? In other words, is it possible that they will still show up on a LexisNexis report?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm not very familiar with LexisNexis, but as it relates to the 3 major credit reporting bureaus, and something that Arthi and I mentioned is that not all medical debt is reported to all 3 bureaus. So unlike other more mainstream consumer credit markets where you could reliably bet that your credit card or your auto loan will be reported to all 3 bureaus, that's not as much the case when it comes to medical debt. So when it comes to removing medical debt, I'm not sure about LexisNexis, but I think that because it's not as widely reported across all 3, if you see it fall off of one, you might have a greater odds that it being removed from all of your credit reports. I hope that helped.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. That was a great answer, Lucas. If you find that a debt is reported to LexisNexis directly, say that the furnisher is reporting it to LexisNexis, then if it falls under the changes that the three NCRAs, the three major credit bureaus reported, then unfortunately you wouldn't be able to use that as a reason to dispute it on your LexisNexis report. However, if it is inaccurate, if it has been, paid, you can still try and submit that complaint or submit it through the CFPB. But the policies that were recently announced on March 18th, I think, apply only to the three credit bureaus.
Thanks,
Thank
Arthur.
you. So we're running out of time here, so I would like to be able to close this out. But again, for everyone who we didn't get specifically to your question, we will keep track of these and we'll be able to come back to some of these questions and try to reach out to you individually with answers or at least guidance to help you find answers to your questions. So again, I'd like to thank you for your time for coming to attend our webinar. And I'd like to remind all of you that our next webinar from the FinX team will be coming out on August 18th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this will be Financial Aid 101. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau will be joined by the U.S. Department of Education to explore Financial Aid 101 and share resources to help students and educators create and pay for college. Again, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate all of your support and effort, and we look forward to working with you more in the future. Again, Tracy, if we can close out the webinar, thank you very much.